Okay, well, I'd just like to say good morning to everyone who's tuning in with us today. And I just wanted also to thank you all for joining us for our online symposium. I think it goes without saying that there have been a lot of disappointments over the past couple of years. So much has been thrown up in the air. Events have been planned and then cancelled and then postponed, and unfortunately our conference was one of them. I can't tell you how much we were looking forward to being able to see you all in person at the Benedict XVI Retreat Centre. And I can't possibly describe the disappointment we all feel, especially considering that this is the second year in a row where we've been unable to hold our conference. Nevertheless, in situations like this, all we can do is make the best of a bad situation, focus on our own interior lives, focus on our prayer lives, and do everything we can to foster our own knowledge of our faith and our own spirituality. So to that end, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Tracey Rowland, who's also one of AXA's patrons. I'll just talk a little bit about her first. So Professor Tracey currently holds the St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. From 2001 and 2017, she was the Dean of the John Paul II Institute in Melbourne, and she holds 2 doctorates in theology, one from Cambridge University and the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome. And as I mentioned before, she has been a patron of AXA since its foundation and is also a member of the International Theological Commission. So I can't possibly understate how lucky we are to have her speak for us this morning. Today she's going to be speaking about Ratzinger and proper inculturation. And if anyone has any other questions, you're more than welcome to leave them in the live stream. Opportunity for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So Professor Tracey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I too am sorry that it's in a situation where we can't all be together, but thank you for going to all the trouble to organise this symposium online. So the concept of a theology of culture is relatively recent in theological discourse, although it does have some patristic era antecedents. Its content includes an analysis of the rise of secularism, the relationship between Christianity and the cultures of modernity and post-modernity, and the role that culture plays in moral development, the character of a specifically Christian culture, and the principles for evangelizing both pre- and post-Christian cultures. Underbedding many of these topics is the relationship between nature and grace, or the question, how does God relate to human persons through time and space? Today's paper will focus on what Joseph Ratzinger has to say about these issues, in particular in 3 different fields: the field of liturgical theology, theological anthropology, and missiology. If one combs through his publications on these topics, one can piece together the broad contours of his theology of culture, including his notion of a proper inculturation. In his work, The Feast of Faith, he took issue with the ideas of Karl Rahner and Herbert Vorgrimler, in which they drew a contrast between utility music and what they called esoteric church music, and in which they promoted the use of utility music, that is, music that is popular or regarded as pedagogically useful. In other publications, Ratzinger refers to the classical Greek distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian music and rules out the suitability of all styles of Dionysian music for liturgical purposes. This includes music that takes the form of a rock beat coupled with Christian, including biblical lyrics. He also expressly endorses the work Music and Ministry, a biblical counterpoint, by Calvin Johansen. Johansen identifies two common problematic tendencies among liturgists as the problem of pastoral pragmatism, the idea defended by Rana and Forgrimler, the idea that you just serve up whatever people want. If they like country and Western music, you serve up country and Western music. If they like rock music, you serve up rock music. That's the pastoral pragmatism idea. And the problem of aestheticism. Johansen argues that there has been a tendency for people to oscillate between the poles of pastoral pragmatism and aestheticism, which is just beauty for the sake of beauty. And Ratzinger agrees with Johansen in Johansen's analysis. Ratzinger agrees that there has been this tendency to oscillate between just giving people whatever they want or appear to want, regardless of its quality, and on the other hand, promoting this idea of beauty for the sake of beauty. Correlationism is a particular approach to the faith and culture relationship that strongly endorses pastoral pragmatism. It became highly popular in the 1960s and 70s among theologians in Belgium and Holland, and it was exported to many other first world countries whose most talented graduate students undertook their doctoral studies in Europe, mainly at the University of Louvain, or Leuven, to give it its Flemish name. When they returned to their home countries, they brought correlationism with them. The general idea was that the faith needed to be correlated to whatever was the cultural milieu in which the people lived. A classic example of correlationism was the statement by Gareth Edwards, published in America magazine in 1966, that the liturgy needs, quote, a language as contemporary as the Beatles. In other words, if the Beatles, the 1960s pop group from Liverpool, were the most engaging phenomenon within contemporary youth culture, then the church needed to correlate the faith to their culture. This mentality was not isolated to a few academics. It became all pervasive in Catholic schools, seminaries, and parishes. Across the globe, folk masses with guitar strumming and even rock masses with drums replaced liturgical rituals with polyphony, Gregorian chant, or solemn hymns. Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was highly critical of this entire movement. He declared that the church is not an institution like a haberdashery shop that updates its windows with new fashions every season. His criticisms of rock and much contemporary popular music as being unsuitable for liturgical purposes was similar to that of the English philosopher Roger Scruton, who died in 2020, and shares some elements in common with Max Horkheimer's criticisms of the culture industry. Ratzinger tacitly agrees with Scruton's judgment that much popular music arrests people in a state of adolescent psychological maturity. And he agrees with Horkheimer that much contemporary music is simply a mass-marketed commodity and thus something unsuitable for liturgical purposes. Implicit within many of Ratzinger's publications is the notion that the liturgy itself generates a culture, or to put the idea more concretely, that liturgical language should penetrate the language of daily usage, rather than the language of daily usage penetrating the territory of liturgical language. In Principles of Catholic Theology, he wrote that the church is, quote, an independent linguistic subject that is united by the common basic experience of faith and thus possessed of a common understanding. This is consistent with what linguistic philosophers call the expressivist theory of language, that emphasizes the importance of a common culture for the correct understanding of words and phrases. Moreover, Ratzinger argues that the Holy Spirit acts to make the process by which the individual becomes capable of speech a part of the process by which he is incorporated into the church. The gifts of the Holy Spirit are therefore an important element of Christian pedagogy, often ignored by so-called rationalist academics. Unpacking that, there are two really significant points there to understand. The first is the point about linguistic philosophy. The idea that culture comes first before language is one of these principles of the expressivist theory of language, which we find in linguistic philosophy. To give you a concrete understanding of it, if you think about the words of the song Waltzing Matilda, those words are English words, but if you were to say to someone who speaks English from another country, Waltzing Matilda, if you were to give them the lyrics about jumbucks and billabongs and waterholes and troopers, the chances are that they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about because they don't have the background Australian culture. And the point that Ratzinger is making is a similar point, that if you really want to understand the language of the liturgy, then the culture of Catholicism comes first. He also makes the second point about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And he actually argues that the Holy Spirit helps us to understand the sacred words in the liturgy, that we're not simply in a situation where we have to do a doctorate in theology in order to understand what something like "and the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us" means, that the Holy Spirit is actively involved in helping us to understand the words and the language of the liturgy. In his book, In the Spirit of the Liturgy, Ratzinger went so far as to draw an analogy between pastoral pragmatism and the Hebrews' worship of the golden calf. He argued that the cult conducted by the high priest Aaron was not deliberately idolatrous. The apostasy was much more subtle. He said there was no turning away from God to the false gods. Outwardly, the people remained attached to the same God. They wanted to glorify God who led Israel out of Egypt, and they believe that they may properly represent his mysterious power in the image of a bull calf. And yet it is a falling away from the worship of God to idolatry. Worship is no longer going up to God, but drawing God down into one's own world. Worship becomes a feast that the community gives itself, a festival of self-affirmation. Instead of being worship of God, it becomes a circle closed in on itself. The dance around the golden calf is an image of this self-seeking worship. It is a kind of banal self-gratification. So that's Ratzinger's analysis of the passage in the book of Exodus where people start worshipping the golden calf. He says the people did not think that they were doing anything wrong, but they thought that what would be good would be if somehow the conception of God could be made concrete in the golden calf, that the people would be able to relate to that much more easily than this notion of Yahweh, someone they cannot see, someone who is totally transcendent to them. And so Ratzinger draws an analogy between what happened in the book of Exodus with the worship of the golden calf and what is happening today in some of our liturgies, where instead of the whole focus of the liturgy being worship of God, the focus of the liturgy becomes looking in upon ourselves, celebrating the community, celebrating the parish, trying to bring God down to our level rather than us trying to look upwards to God. And he says it's actually a form of idolatry, this notion that God should be brought down to the level of the people. In place of pastoral pragmatism, give them whatever they want. And in place of correlationism, try and tie the presentation of the faith and the church's liturgy to the contemporary popular culture. Ratzinger offers an alternative approach to liturgy and to the faith-culture relationship in general that might be described as Trinitarian transformationism. It is an approach that is theocentric, not anthropocentric, God-centered, not human-centered. It involves all three persons of the Trinity. Its objective is to bring the human person into communion with the Holy Trinity. It creates its own culture based on explicitly biblical hieratic language and music that is solemn and sacred, directed to bringing creation into the mode of being of the Holy Spirit and its consequent transformation, exemplified in the crucified and resurrected Christ. At a liturgical conference at Fontainebleau Abbey in 2001, Ratzinger declared that the Greek Church Fathers understood that the sacrifice of prayer should not be mere speech, but the transmutation of our being into the Logos, the union of ourselves with it. While in historically Christian countries, pastoral pragmatism often took the form of pop culture correlationism, in countries where Christians are a minority group, pastoral pragmatism often took the form of a nationalist or tribal correlationism. The issue was addressed by Ratzinger in a landmark address to the bishops of Asia. In this address, he explicitly rejected the idea that each individual national group might provide its own culture in which to wrap the faith and its liturgical expressions. He said, "One might think that the culture is the affair of the individual historical country, while faith for its part is in search of cultural expression. The individual cultures would allocate, as it were, a cultural body to faith. Accordingly, faith would always have to live from borrowed cultures, which remain in the end somehow external and capable of being cast off. Such thinking is at root Manichaean. Culture is debased, becoming a mere exchangeable shell, and faith is reduced to a disincarnated spirit, ultimately void of reality." And that, that sort of attitude that the way to present the faith is to hook it up to some kind of nationalist cultural shell, like the body of a tortoise is hooked up to the shell of a tortoise. That mentality is really, really strong, and it's what Ratzinger regards as a really bad idea of inculturation, a really self-destructive idea of inculturation. Ratzinger also endorsed the judgment of St. Basil the Great that pre-Christian cultures are like a sycamore tree that bears tasteless fruit unless one carefully slits the tree and allows its sap to run out, whereby it becomes flavorful. According to Ratzinger, all pre-Christian cultures need to be slit by means of the Logos. Only Christian revelation can bring to fruition all elements of truth, beauty, and goodness lying nascent within the pre-Christian culture. The evangelization of a pre-Christian culture, therefore, cannot take place without making a wound within the culture into which the Logos can be inserted. Since, however, all of creation bears vestiges of the Trinity, even pre-Christian cultures will carry within themselves some of these vestiges that can be affirmed after the slit or wound has been made. Ratzinger stands in a line of intellectual tradition from the patristic St. Augustine through to the medieval St. Bonaventure, up to the modern St. John Henry Newman, each one of whom affirmed beauty as a transcendental property of being. In this sense, he stands at a polar opposite position from strains of Reformed theology that see the Christian affirmation of beauty as a negative pagan influence. Though he does acknowledge that beauty can be highly problematic if it is separated from truth and goodness. In his work, The Feast of Faith, he wrote, "The Church must not settle down with what is merely comfortable and serviceable at the parish level. She must arouse the voice of the cosmos, and by glorifying the Creator, elicit the glory of the cosmos itself, making it glorious, beautiful, habitable, and beloved. The Church must maintain high standards. She must be a place where beauty can be at home. She must lead the struggle for that spiritualization without which the world becomes the first circle of hell." So far there, I have talked mostly about Ratzinger's criticisms of really bad ideas of inculturation, ideas that have been popular in the church since the 1960s that have led, at worst, to some kind of form of idolatry, this worship of ourselves in the liturgy, or the worship of the community in the liturgy. Or they have simply been strategies to tie the faith to some shell, like a nationalist culture or some contemporary pop culture icon that has the effect of actually marginalizing the faith. And in those circumstances, the faith can't actually have any real influence on the general culture. It is always in a position that is subordinate to something else. So now, looking at the position more positively, a place to start if you really want to understand Ratzinger's notion of a Trinitarian transformation of culture is to actually read the book Christendom Awake, written by Aidan Nichols, who is one of the leading Anglophone authorities on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger. And he explains that if you want a Trinitarian transformation of culture, you have to understand how the Trinity actually operates within the culture. And I have one paragraph I'm going to read, which is pretty theologically dense, but I hope to unpack it for you. And it appears on page 17 of the book Christendom Awake, if you can get a hold of that book. And it really gives the foundation for a Trinitarian account of inculturation. So Nichols says, "A culture should be conscious of transcendence as its true origin and goal. And this we call culture's tacit paterological dimension." Okay, so when we talk about a paterological dimension, we mean a dimension which relates to God the Father. The second, the forms which a culture employs should manifest integrity, wholeness, and interconnectedness, clarity, transparency to meaning, and harmony. And these qualities, such as integrity, clarity, and harmony, are appropriated in classical theology to the divine Son, the art of God, and the splendor of the Father. And so we talk about such qualities as the Christological aspects of culture. And then thirdly, the spiritually vital and health-giving character of the moral ethos of our culture yields up the pneumatological dimension, which is the dimension of the Holy Spirit. So to try and unpack that for you, the idea is that within the realm of culture, there are some dimensions that are paterological, some that are Christological, some that are pneumatological, some that pertain to God the Father, some that pertain more to Christ, some that can be related more to the Holy Spirit. And these three dimensions, the paterological, Christological, and pneumatological, correspond roughly to three different concepts of culture which appear in the German language. The Germans have three concepts, three words they use for culture, where the English has only culture. So the Germans have the word Kultur, K-U-L-T-U-R. They have the word Bildung, B-I-L-D-U-N-G, and they have the word Geist, G-E-I-S-T. Kultur tends to refer to the overall form of a culture, its fundamental orientation that corresponds to what Nichols would call the paterological dimension of culture. That is, its motivating end. It is also similar to the English concept of civilization. Bildung, which is about the formation of the self or the soul, or more broadly about human education, is roughly analogous to the Christological dimension, since in Catholic theology, the human person is made in the image of God to grow into the likeness of Christ. There is, in other words, a specifically Christian form of Bildung. Finally, the conception of culture as Geist is roughly analogous to the pneumatological dimension of culture. That is, the ethos of institutions that is generated by the interrelationship of the paterological and Christological dimensions. In each of these three dimensions of culture, it is possible for there to be something deformed or defective and in need of healing, and this includes the very notion of culture itself. While there are many different cultures understood in all three senses of the term, and a myriad of deficient and deformed cultures, the most significant cleavage between the Christian and post-Christian conceptions of culture is that Christian conceptions retain the conceptual link between nature and culture. In classical and Christian thought, culture is never something artificial. It is always a development of something that is natural. However, in post-classical and post-Christian conceptions, the link between the natural world and culture was lost. As a result, culture became a creation independent of any natural organic form. Depending on what concept fills the space of the paterological dimension, that is the transcendent dimension, there can be many different, contrary to nature, cultural forms. When class conflict took the place of God the Father in Marxism, then the culture of Bolshevism arose. When power through genetics took the place of God the Father, the culture of National Socialism arose. When upward social mobility and consumerism took the place of God the Father, the culture of late capitalism arose. In every instance, there will be a corresponding understanding of Bildung, or self-education, and a corresponding Geist or ethos of institutions generated by the interrelationship of the paterological and Christological dimensions. Romano Guardini, the great Munich theologian, demonstrated this in his many references to modern culture as a culture with the form of the machine. The parts of a machine are not integrated. They fit together in such a way that the mechanical components only influence the operation of the piece of machinery with which they are in direct contact. There is no unifying principle across the actions of the mechanized human person or culture. The Czech writer and political leader Václav Havel alluded to this when he remarked that people who live in societies where liberalism undergirds the public culture often behave as though they were playing for a number of different teams at once, all with different uniforms, and as though they were uncertain as to which team they ultimately belonged. It was precisely for this reason that Guardini regarded the culture of modernity as anti-human. It operates to thwart possibilities for a coherent integration of the human person. It thereby directly undermines the Christological dimension. In accord with both Guardini and Ratzinger, Nichols concluded, we should not be looking primarily for, quote, inculturation, where the faith so easily disappears into cultural dialogue, nor for acculturation, where the church remains basically external to the cultures in which she acts. Instead of these, we ought to be looking for a culture where Christ, and indeed the entire Trinity, are the agents transforming the culture. How such a transformation is possible is best understood by combining the theology of a number of the encyclicals of the pontificate of St. John Paul II with Benedict XVI's encyclicals on the theological virtues. This gives you the theological anthropology that is required for a healthy culture, and especially for a healthy Christological dimension of culture. In the suite of St. John Paul II's encyclicals, one finds his Trinitarian theology, Redemptor Hominis, 1979, Dives in Misericordiae, 1980, and Dominum et Vivificantum in 1986, along with his moral theology encyclicals, Veritatis Splendor, 1993, Evangelium Vitae, 1995, and Fides et Ratio, 1998. So if you take all of those encyclicals of John Paul II together, if you read through those, what you get out of those is a theological anthropology. And that theological anthropology helps you to understand how to go about having a healthy Christological dimension of a culture. What Benedict did in his pontificate was to take on board that theological anthropology of John Paul II, but to narrow the focus from the human person's relationship with each person of the Trinity down to the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and how those theological virtues help to develop the human person and the relationship between those virtues and our relationships with the Trinity. If you want to look at how Pope Francis deals with some of these issues, then the place to look is his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium of 2013. With Ratzinger, he agrees that the Trinity is extremely important, but his intellectual leader in this area of the theology of culture appears to be Pedro Arrupe, A-R-R-U-P-E, who was a former Jesuit general. And if you want to read about how different Arrupe's ideas on the theology of culture are from Joseph Ratzinger's ideas, then there is a book by an English theologian. His name is Jacob Phillips, and the book is called Mary, the Star of Evangelization, published in 2018 by Paulist Press. Jacob has a section in that book where he explains the difference between Ratzinger's understanding of the theology of culture and Arupe's. And it's really well written, and that would be my recommendation for where to go if you're interested in the contrast. But in short, Arupe is much more inclined to go down a correlationist route. That's the short story. Now, I've mentioned the theological anthropology of St. John Paul II and Ratzinger's encyclicals on the theological virtues as places to go if you want to get an understanding of not just the human person's relationship with the Trinity, which is absolutely fundamental, but how that can affect the possibilities for a Christological dimension of culture. But if we move now to the pneumatological dimension, what we're looking at here is the ethos of our institutions. So, for example, the ethos of our Catholic schools, the ethos of our Catholic hospitals, the ethos of all those agencies that are run by the Catholic Church. So the first point here is that institutions that are run by the Church should have an ethos, should have a moral dimension, which is radically different from secular institutions. And the way in which most of our Catholic institutions, or at least some of them, are falling short of that is that instead of being governed by Christian principles, they tend to be governed by the principles of contemporary management theory. So the ethos of modern corporations, the whole mode of being and operating of modern corporations is being moved into Catholic institutions and starting to govern our Catholic institutions. One of the chief characteristics of corporate management practices is that they are designed to leave employees with little or no freedom to take personal responsibilities for their actions. Individuals are to follow protocols and procedures and thus exercise no personal judgment. Prudential judgment is thwarted by layers and layers of bureaucratic red tape. One of the elements of the abuse crisis was the tendency of bishops to delegate their personal episcopal authority to lawyers, accountants, or other committees of experts. This now routinely happens in less weighty matters. Episcopal responsibilities are delegated to business managers, accountants, lawyers, and whole bureaucracies of lay so-called experts. This is notwithstanding the fact that episcopal authority is a form of what management theorists would describe as charismatic authority, not bureaucratic authority. Notwithstanding how things are in theory, the trend of the last half-century has been for bishops to govern their dioceses according to the principles of bureaucratic rationality. Many, though not all bishops, have allowed themselves to become chief executive officers of Catholic Inc. When their experts make poor decisions, even decisions inconsistent with Catholic teaching, they are often reluctant to intervene. This is a complex issue since bishops often find themselves confronted with a double assault on their charismatic authority. One assault comes from political leaders who attempt to exert control over the Church by encroaching upon the Church's authority and circumscribing the authority of bishops. The most serious example in recent times is the attempt by governments to demand that priests break the seal of the confessional. There are, however, hundreds of less serious examples of governments demanding that the Church report on her internal activities. Throughout history, governments have sought to control the Church by controlling the appointment of bishops. And the Chinese Communist Party is the most recent example of this. The other source of assault comes from within the church, with the lay experts seeking to extend their own authority over the charismatic authority of priests and bishops. The Austrian Wir sind Kirche movement is the most extreme example of this assault. Wir sind Kirche went as far as having priestless private Eucharistic celebrations. The end result of democratization is always more bureaucracy. And the end result of the bureaucratization of the church's institutions and agencies is that it is sometimes difficult to see how ostensibly Catholic institutions in the education and health fields are in any way different from education and health institutions run by the state. Management protocols often preclude the kind of heart-to-heart relationship that is really required in a fully functional Catholic institution. Risk management protocols written by lawyers discourage forms of human communication that operate on a more personal and spiritual level. Again, the issues are complex because in some instances a conflict of interest would arise if a more personal approach were to be taken. These complex problems have largely arisen in the post-conciliar era with the decline in religious vocations and the simultaneous rise of a class of professional laity. In various interviews, rather than in his more academic pieces, Ratzinger Benedict has remarked that the church needs less bureaucracy and more holiness. In his book, The Office of Peter and the Structure of the Church, Hans-Urs von Balthasar was of the view that the provincialization of the church would simply lead to more bureaucratization at the local level, and the church militant would descend to the level of becoming what he called the photocopying church. And Ratzinger Benedict, in many of his publications, strongly endorsed that view. So I want to now, in say the last 5 minutes, just to try and draw all of those strands together for you, just trying to synthesize all of that. The first point is that since at least the middle of the 20th century, a big issue in the life of the church has been how to relate faith and culture, how to contend with secularism. And there have basically been two alternative positions put forward. The correlationist position, which is you try and take the faith and hook it up to something that is popular within the culture and try and market the faith as correlating to whatever it is that's popular. That's one position that's been taken, and that position was really pushed very strongly in the 1960s by theologians in Belgium and Holland. And today we see that in Australia with the so-called Leuven project that is used in Catholic schools, or at least in some Catholic schools. Leuven is like, the Leuven project is like second generation correlationism. The word correlationism isn't used in the Leuven project. Instead, the word that is used is recontextualization. But the theology underpinning recontextualization is just a second generation version of the theology that underpinned correlationism. In each case, it's the culture that positions the Trinity and the faith, not the Trinity and the faith that positions culture. The alternative position is the Ratzinger position. And the Ratzinger position is this notion of a Trinitarian transformation of culture. And to understand that, you need, first of all, to understand the role of the three persons of the Trinity in the economy of salvation. And you especially need to understand how each member of the Trinity relates to the human person. So what is, say, my relationship to God the Father, to Christ, to the Holy Spirit? You need to have that. It's like Catholic Faith 101. St. John Paul II understood that there was a lot of confusion about this, and so he published 3 encyclicals dealing precisely with that issue. And so if you take those Trinitarian encyclicals of the Pontificate of JP2, add to them his 2 moral theology encyclicals and his account of the relationship between faith and reason, and if you then add that body of scholarship to Pope Benedict's work on the theological virtues, you get a nice theological anthropology, which, if applied, has a massive impact upon what Ada Nichols calls the Christological dimension of culture. When it comes to the paterological dimension, that is the dimension of culture, which is the macro level dimension. It's the issue of what drives a culture. Our contemporary culture is largely driven by economics. So economics is our God, not God the Father. Marxist cultures were also driven by the God of economics. A fascist culture, in the case of Nazi Germany, was driven by a mixture of neo-pagan gods and this worship of genetics. So you can look at cultures and say, what drives them? What is the fundamental dynamic of a culture? And that is what, in theology, we would call its paterological dimension. And then finally, you can look at the ethos of institutions, the principles and policies which govern the operation of institutions, and ask, where do these ideas come from? And in the works of Ratzinger, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, for example, he talks about the way that Catholic institutions should treat people within them as persons and should try and mediate the love of God to those persons. It's a very different notion of how to run an institution from corporate governance practices. And that is not to say that all administration is bad or that all policies and protocols are bad, but it is to say that at the moment in the life of our Catholic institutions, one of the problems is corporate practices trumping Christian practices. In any event, there is this notion of a pneumatological dimension linked to the ethos of institutions. And in Ratzinger's theology, that dimension too needs to be a Christian dimension. So you can bring together a whole understanding of a Trinitarian transformation of culture by going to particular works of Ratzinger and seeing what he has to say about the dynamics governing a culture, the principles governing the formation of the human person, and the principles governing the ethos of institutions. And in every single case, he will give you a specifically Catholic way of approaching those issues that has nothing to do with tying the faith up to whatever happens to be popular within the broader general secular culture. So it's a very, very different approach from the correlationist or recontextualist approach. It's an approach which actually wants to transform the wider culture, relying upon faith in the Trinity and the graces of the Incarnation. I will end there and open up for questions, but I would just say that if at any time you want to email me and ask me for advice on where to go to find out about different topics in theology, including, where does Ratzinger say this or where does he deal with that, please feel very welcome to email me. My email address is tracy.rowland@nd.edu.au, and I'm more than happy to field questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tracey, for that incredible talk. So we do have a few questions already. I might begin with Marnie. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. She'd like to ask whether there would be a summary or like a summary or some notes that might be available after this presentation, which I suppose ties into the last comment.
Yes, I can certainly send. I'll send 3 papers, in fact. What I did was basically splice together 3 different papers that I have written, and I can send all 3 papers to you, Alex, and you can send them out to whoever wants.
Wonderful. We have a few questions that are asking about the new motto which came out yesterday. Would you like to make any comment about that?
Well, I guess that I imagine there'll be a lot of people feeling completely gutted this morning, and my number one piece of advice is to keep calm and to read Ratzinger. I really think that Cardinal Ratzinger is a scholar, and he was one of the greatest Catholic scholars of the 20th century. And he understands the realm of culture, and he understands the realm of liturgy. In his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, he said that people who are attached to the extraordinary form have been treated like leopards. That was his expression. And he said there has never been anything like that in the history of the church before. His position on these issues was that he thought that the 2 rites needed to sort of modify one another. He thought that what was good about the new rite was that the scriptures were in the vernacular. He thought it was really good that scriptures are read in the vernacular. But he thought that the canon of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, could all have been kept in either the Greek in the case of the Kyrie or everything else in Latin. And he understood that in many parts of the world, the effect of the introduction of the new rite was to generate these, what he called parish tea party liturgies, self-centric liturgies, which he said are just a form of idolatry. So he understood that there had been an abuse, a wide-scale abuse of the new rite, and that was leading to a loss of faith, a horrendous loss of faith in many parts of the world. So he hoped that if there were these 2 rites that were operating, that they would sort of mutually reform each other, that the operation of the extraordinary form would perhaps open the eyes of some of the faithful to the need for a theocentric form of worship, while the fact that the scriptures were in the vernacular in the so-called new rite would be something that might eventually somehow morph into the extraordinary form. I don't know how he saw that happening. But I think that Ratzinger is someone who really understands why the extraordinary form is so popular, because it is so transcendent, and because it has a hieratic language, so a sacred language. We know, we're told that in France, about 30% of people who go to Mass every Sunday are going to the extraordinary form. We know that many of the religious orders that are booming are ones where the priests are saying the extraordinary form. And that includes charismatic communities, so not just communities that are somehow stuck in the pre-1960 era, but communities where people have taken on board some of the really good developments of the past 50 years, but also want the extraordinary form as a part of that. So I would say that I would say, do not lose heart, do not be depressed, be courageous. You're all very young, which is one thing you've got on your side. I imagine that when each one of you is as old as I am now, you will just be at a stage in life when grandchildren will be starting to arrive, and you'll be telling them about these weird things that happened in the last decade in the life of the church. And they'll look at you with big eyes and think, you can't be serious. But that is what it will be like, I think. Time is on your side, on the side of your generation. You should be hopeful. And, the important thing is that you just don't lose heart and you don't kind of go crazy. And it is the case that, unfortunately, some people in some extraordinary form communities do go a bit crazy. They get a bit neurotic and they end up occupying some positions that are a bit extreme. But just, keep calm. One thing that I have found a little bit concerning about some of the extraordinary form communities in the Anglophone world, not in the French world, but in the Anglophone world, is that I think there is a tendency in some of these communities to go down an Amish path. And it's like a kind of wholesale opposition to anything modern. And I think we're not Amish, we're not Mennonites. We're Catholics. And so don't become Mennonite, don't become Amish. And read the good stuff, the good theological stuff that has come out since the 1950s. And it's easy to do that. Like, you can just get your name onto the catalogues of some of the really faithful Catholic publishing houses. And I would start with Ignatius Press. Anything that comes out of Ignatius Press is trustworthy. Anything that comes out of Emmaus Academic, which is associated with Steubenville University in the States, anything that comes out of there is fantastic. So just get onto the good mailing lists, get onto the good publishing house catalogues, and read all the really excellent theology that has been coming out in the past 50 years. There's been an enormous amount of rubbish too, but while being critical of the rubbish, also be open to all the really good work. And just support each other. We'll get through this.
Okay, I think those are very wise words indeed. Incidentally, I think you've also given us an idea for some merchandising opportunities. Shirts that say "Keep calm and read Ratzinger." We'll make sure to send you the royalty checks. Okay, we probably have time for just one more question. So what I might suggest for everyone else who has left questions in the chat, if perhaps they might be able to send them through to our page, and perhaps we could forward them to you, and we could get the answers to them at some point down the line.
Sure, certainly.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we've got one question from Greg, who asks, what do you think of the influence of Hegel on Ratzinger's thought?
There's been very, very little influence of Hegel on Ratzinger's thought. The person who's been really seriously influenced by Hegel is Walter Kasper, who was like Ratzinger's nemesis in the world of the German bishops. Kasper has consistently been critical of Ratzinger for decades. And Kasper just keeps criticizing Ratzinger for being a Platonist. I don't think the difference between, I don't think Ratzinger's Platonism or his love of Augustine is the real issue between he and Kasper. I think it's Kasper's love of Hegel that is the real issue. So that's my first general response. My second response is that I'm currently editing a book, which I hope will be out by this time next year. And it's a book on Ratzinger and his relationship to 20 different philosophers. So what was his position on 20 different philosophers? And in that, there will be an essay by Cyril O'Regan, who is at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. He's a leading authority on Hegel in the world, and he will be writing an essay in that book on Ratzinger's relationship, so to speak, with Hegel. So that will be the definitive answer.
Well, wonderful. I think we'll all be looking forward to that. I'd just like to thank you again for speaking for us today and for doing your best to reassure us in these difficult times as well. And again, I'd like to thank everyone who's tuned in with us today. We've gone a bit over time, but Mass will be live streamed in the next few minutes, so you can find it on the page. We'll make sure that's readily available. So especially for those of us who can't attend Mass in person right now, I think it'd be a wonderful opportunity just to tune in and experience something at least. Once again, thank you, Professor Tracey.
Thank you so much. God bless everyone. Bye.